Good morning. Welcome to today's story, a touching, humane, and educational tale.
They
And
threw Ethan Walker out on a windy March night with a backpack, a worn-out jacket, and a toolbox that still smelled like his dead father's hands. By sunrise, the 17-year-old boy would be walking alone through a small Midwestern town, not knowing that the same people who looked right through him now would one day depend on the life he built from what they had thrown away. This story is about more than survival. It is about self-worth, quiet courage, and the hard American truth that sometimes losing the place you called home is the first step toward becoming the person you were always meant to be. Ethan Walker had lived in Belridge, Missouri, his whole life. It was the kind of town where people still waved from pickup trucks, where the church sign changed every Saturday night, and where everybody knew who was struggling, even if they pretended not to. There used to be a lumber mill just outside town, and when Ethan was little, that mill gave men a reason to get up before dawn and come home tired with sawdust on their boots. Then the mill closed. After that, Belridge felt quieter, smaller, a little more tired every year. Ethan's father, Roy Walker, had been one of the men who could fix almost anything. Lawnmower engines, water heaters, rusted hinges, school bleachers. People used to say Roy had steady hands and a patient mind. Ethan remembered those hands better than almost anything else. Big, rough, grease-darkened, always building, always repairing, always making something useful out of what other people had given up on. Roy died when Ethan was 11. A logging chain snapped loose on a wet morning outside county lines. The accident was quick, they said. People always said that, like it was supposed to help. It never did. After that, Ethan's mother, Carla, changed in ways he didn't understand at first. She still packed lunches, still paid bills, still smiled when neighbors came by. But something in her went dim. She moved through the years like a woman carrying too much weight and too little rest. By the time Ethan turned 15, she had married Dean Holloway. Dean sold insurance in Springfield and liked to talk about fresh starts and moving forward. He wore polished boots that never saw mud, kept his truck cleaner than most people kept their kitchens, and smiled the most when other people were watching. At first, Ethan tried to make peace with him. He kept his room clean, did the yard work, stayed out of the way. But Dean did not want peace. Dean wanted control. And Ethan was a reminder that this house, this family, this life had existed before he got there. At first, it was small things. Dean calling the garage junked up, even though it still held Roy's old tools. Dean telling Carla that Ethan was old enough to fend for himself. Dean making jokes at dinner about boys who hid in sheds and played mechanic instead of planning a real future. Carla would flinch sometimes, but she would not fight him. That hurt Ethan almost as much as Dean did. By the week of his 17th birthday, the tension in the house had turned sharp. You could feel it in the silence, in the way Carla washed the same plate twice, in the way Dean stood in doorways like he owned every room before he even entered it. Then one Saturday afternoon, Ethan came home from helping a neighbor stack firewood and found the garage half empty. His father's tool chest was gone. The old vise Roy had bolted to the workbench was gone. 3 milk crates full of sockets, wrenches, belts, spare carburetor parts, and weathered instruction manuals were gone. Ethan stopped cold in the driveway. Dean was inside the garage with the door open, measuring the wall. "What happened?" Ethan asked. Dean didn't even turn around right away. "We cleaned it out." Ethan's throat tightened. "That was my dad's stuff." Dean finally looked at him. "It was clutter. I'm turning this into a home office." "You sold it?" Dean shrugged. "Got a decent price, too." Something hot and raw tore through Ethan's chest. "You had no right." Dean stepped closer, voice low, crisp and mean. "You want to talk about rights? You're 17. You eat food I pay for. You sleep under a roof I maintain. And I'm done funding this moody little freeloading act." Carla was standing just inside the kitchen door now, one hand pressed to her mouth. Ethan looked at her. She looked back at him and said nothing. That was the moment something in him broke. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to make the room feel colder. That night, the fight got worse. Dean said Ethan's birthday meant adulthood was around the corner. And if he thought he was such a man, he could prove it somewhere else. Ethan said things he had swallowed for years. Dean shouted back. Carla cried. A lamp nearly tipped over in the living room. The whole house felt like it had been waiting for this moment. Then Dean picked up Ethan's backpack, shoved in a few clothes, grabbed the small metal toolbox Ethan had hidden in his closet, and threw both onto the front porch. "You want independence?" Dean snapped. "Go get it!" Ethan stood there, breathing hard. Carla whispered his name, not to stop him, just to soften the sound of losing him. He looked at her one last time, at the woman who had once tucked him in during thunderstorms, at the woman who now stood frozen beside another man while her son was pushed out of his own home. Ethan bent down, picked up the backpack, picked up the toolbox, and stepped into the cold night air. Behind him, the porch light glowed warm and yellow. Then the door closed. And for the first time in his 17 years, Ethan Walker had nowhere to go. Ethan Walker had nowhere to go. For a while, he just stood there on the front porch, the cold cutting through his jacket, the toolbox hanging heavy from one hand. The March wind had a sharp Missouri edge to it, the kind that slipped under your clothes and made you feel even more alone than you already were. The porch light stayed on behind him. No one opened the door again. No one came after him. After a minute, then 5, then maybe 10, Ethan stepped off the porch and started walking. Belridge was quiet at night. A few porch lights glowed along Maple Street. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A television flickered blue through the curtains of a living room across the road. Everything looked painfully normal, like the whole town had agreed to keep breathing while Ethan's life had just cracked open. He kept his head down and walked past houses he'd known since childhood. Mrs. Turner's white fence, the cracked basketball hoop in the Reynolds driveway, the little brick church where his dad used to shake hands with everybody on Sunday mornings. He thought about knocking on someone's door, just one door, just long enough to ask if he could sit somewhere warm until morning. But small towns had a way of making pity feel public, and Ethan could already hear the questions. "What happened, son? Where's your mother? Why aren't you home?" He could not bear the thought of saying it out loud, so he kept walking. By midnight, he ended up near the old grain elevator on the edge of town and sat down on a low concrete wall behind a feed store. He set the toolbox between his boots and pulled his jacket tighter around himself. The wind smelled like damp dirt and rusted metal. He didn't sleep much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Dean's hand throwing that backpack. He saw his mother standing there, silent and pale, like somebody had taken all the fight out of her years ago. Just before dawn, Ethan stood up, stiff and aching, and started walking again. The sky was turning that washed-out gray that came before sunrise. He headed toward downtown because it was the only place that made any sense. If he was going to figure something out, it had to start there. The diner wouldn't open for another hour. The hardware store was dark. Main Street looked tired in the early morning light, with empty parking spaces and paper flyers taped crooked in old windows. Ethan stood outside the gas station, counted the money in his pocket, and found $8.30. Not enough for a room, barely enough for food. He bought a coffee and the cheapest breakfast biscuit they had. The cashier, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a gray mustache, barely looked at him. Ethan was grateful for that. He took the coffee outside and sat on the curb. That was when he remembered the old market lot. Years ago, before the big grocery chain opened 20 miles away, Belridge had a small farmer's market out near the county road. Roy used to take Ethan there in the summer sometimes, buying peaches, tomatoes, sweet corn, whatever was in season. Most of it had been shut down for years now. A few sheds still stood. One loading dock too, if Ethan remembered right. Maybe there'd be some cover there. Maybe a place to think. It was farther than he wanted to walk, but walking was free, so he went. By the time Ethan reached the market lot, the sun had climbed higher, pale and cool behind thin clouds. The place looked even more abandoned than he remembered. The old produce signs were faded almost white. Tall weeds pushed up through the cracked gravel. One side of the property had sagging chain-link fencing, and the loading dock looked like it had not seen real work in a decade. He stepped carefully through the weeds and around a pile of warped pallets. Then he saw it. Parked behind the far end of the lot, half hidden by brush and a leaning sheet of rusted tin, sat an old box truck. It had once been white maybe, but time had turned it a dull, chalky gray. The tires were low. Rust crawled along the wheel wells and lower panels. One side mirror hung crooked. The windshield was dirty but not shattered, and the back cargo door was shut tight. Ethan stopped and stared at it. It looked dead, forgotten, left behind the same way a lot of things in Belridge had been left behind. He walked closer. The cab smelled like dust and old vinyl when he managed to pry the driver's door open. Papers lay scattered across the floorboard. An empty soda bottle rolled under the seat. A mouse had probably lived there once. Maybe still did. The bench seat was cracked. The glove compartment hung open on one hinge, but it was dry. And the cargo box, once Ethan fought with the side latch and forced one door partway open, was even better. Dark, dirty, cold, but dry. There were old produce crates stacked against one wall, a broken dolly, and years of dirt and leaves blown in through gaps around the frame. Still, it had a roof. It had walls. It had a floor that wasn't open ground. For the first time since the night before, Ethan felt something close to relief. Not hope exactly, but relief. He set down his backpack and toolbox and just stood there for a moment, breathing. Well, he muttered to himself, his voice sounding strange in the hollow dark. It beats a sidewalk. The words almost made him laugh. Almost. He spent the next hour dragging out trash, kicking aside splintered wood, and clearing a small space near the front of the cargo box. He found an old feed sack in the corner and used it to sweep dirt into a pile. His hands got filthy. His back ached. But by noon, there was a patch of floor big enough to sit on. It wasn't much, but it was his. Later that afternoon, Ethan walked back into town and tried to find work. He asked at the diner first. No openings. Then the gas station. Too young for evening shift, the man said. Then a lawn service lot by the highway. Need a truck and references. At the feed store, the owner barely let him finish speaking before saying, can't put a kid on payroll without paperwork. By the fifth rejection, Ethan had stopped asking with any confidence. He kept hearing the same thing in different voices. Too young, too complicated, not our problem. He was passing an old secondhand store on Willow Street when he saw a wobbling metal fan sitting outside with a handwritten tag taped to it. $5, as is. One of the blades was bent. The front cage was loose. Without really thinking, Ethan crouched down, pulled a screwdriver from his toolbox, tightened the center cap, bent the blade back by hand, and adjusted the cage until it sat straight. When he plugged it into the outdoor outlet beside the door, the fan rattled once, then hummed to life. A woman's voice behind him said, well now. Ethan turned. Standing in the doorway was a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s wearing a denim overshirt and work gloves. Her silver-brown hair was pulled back in a loose knot, and her eyes were sharp in a way that suggested she missed very little. I was about to haul that thing to the dumpster, she said. Ethan stood up too fast. Sorry, I wasn't stealing anything. She gave him a dry look. Didn't say you were. He swallowed. The blade was catching, that's all. She stepped forward, looked at the fan, then looked back at him. You know what you're doing? A little. She studied the toolbox in his hand, the worn corners, the initials RW scratched into the metal. Then she said, store opens in 10 minutes. If you're willing to lift, sort, and keep your mouth shut when customers get annoying, I can use help for half a day. Ethan stared at her. He had not expected kindness, not even practical kindness. What's it pay? He asked quietly. She almost smiled. Enough for you to buy supper, she said, and maybe a little more, if you work like you mean it. Her name, he would learn soon enough, was Martha Reed. And by the time the sun began to drop behind the old buildings of Belridge that evening, Ethan would be walking back toward that abandoned truck with sore arms, a little cash in his pocket, and one steady thought he had not dared to believe the night before. Maybe he was not just looking for somewhere to hide. Maybe he was looking for something he could build. That evening, Ethan Walker walked back to the old market lot with $42 in his pocket, a paper sack with 2 sandwiches from the diner, and a tiredness so deep it seemed to settle into his bones. It was more money than he had expected. Not much by most standards, but enough to make the world feel a little less hostile than it had the night before. The sky over Belridge had turned the soft gray blue of early spring dusk. A cool wind moved through the weeds around the abandoned lot, rattling the loose metal on the loading dock and stirring the dry grass along the fence line. Ethan stepped around broken pallets, ducked past a leaning post, and made his way back to the box truck. For one brief second, when he saw it again in the fading light, his chest tightened. He had the strange fear that something would have changed, that someone would have locked it, or claimed it, or hauled it off. But it was still there, quiet, rusting, waiting. He climbed into the cargo box, set down the paper sack, and sat on the cleared patch of floor he had made earlier. The truck still smelled like dust, old wood, and forgotten summers. It was not comfortable. It was not clean. But after the day he had had, it felt almost like shelter. He ate slowly. 1 sandwich for supper, 1 for breakfast. That was how his father used to think about things. Not just what you need now, What you will need when morning comes. The thought of Roy Walker came sudden and sharp, like a nail catching skin. Ethan looked down at the old metal toolbox beside him. The initials scratched into the side were shallow but familiar. R.W. His father had scratched them there with a pocket knife years ago, after another mechanic at the county shed kept borrowing his sockets and forgetting to bring them back. Ethan rested his hand on the lid for a long moment. Then he opened it. Inside were the few tools he had managed to save before Dean sold off the rest. A couple of screwdrivers, needle nose pliers, an adjustable wrench, electrical tape, a socket set with 3 missing pieces, and tucked beneath the tray, folded twice and creased from years of being moved around, was an old shop rag Ethan did not remember seeing before. He pulled it out. Something small and stiff dropped onto the floor. A photograph. Ethan picked it up carefully. The edges were yellowed and one corner had bent almost white with age. It showed a younger version of his father standing beside a delivery truck, smiling into the sun with his sleeves rolled up. Roy's hair was darker then. His shoulders looked broad and easy, like the world had not started wearing him down yet. Behind him was a sign on a low wooden building, River County Mobile Supply. And behind that, Ethan squinted. A loading dock, a fence, a slanted rooftop he almost recognized. He looked up slowly, then back at the photo, then around the inside of the truck. His pulse picked up. "This truck," he whispered. He stood and moved into the cab, opening the driver's side again. He checked the glove box first. Nothing but brittle registration papers and an empty pack of gum. Then he crouched between the seats and ran his hand along the back wall. There, a loose panel behind the passenger seat. It had probably once been held in place by clips, but one side had slipped free. Ethan worked his fingers into the gap and pulled. The panel shifted with a dry scrape, revealing a narrow compartment behind it. Inside was a weathered canvas pouch and a spiral notebook, and 2 thin maintenance manuals curled at the edges from age. Ethan sat back on the bench seat, heart thudding. The pouch held a handful of receipts, a flashlight that no longer worked, and a stubby carpenter's pencil. But the notebook was his father's. Ethan knew it instantly from the handwriting. Roy had written in clean, steady block letters, the kind mechanics used when they needed numbers and instructions to stay readable no matter how much grease got on the page. The first half of the notebook was exactly what Ethan expected. Oil changes, part numbers, tire sizes, notes on wiring, fuel pump issues, hand-drawn diagrams of hose routes and battery connections. But then the entries changed. The notes got more personal, not emotional exactly. Roy had never been that kind of man on paper, but practical in a way that carried love inside it. Patch roof seam before winter. Use rubber strip if no sealant. Keep dry storage high off floor. Mice get into everything low. Solar lights from farm store work fine if battery's good. Small place can still be decent if it's clean, warm, and yours. Ethan stared at that last line until the words blurred. A small place can still be decent if it's clean, warm, and yours. His father had written that, maybe years ago. Maybe standing in this exact truck, maybe never knowing his son would one day be sitting here, cold and thrown out, reading it like a message sent forward through time. Ethan swallowed hard and kept reading. There were ideas in those pages, simple ones, useful ones. How to brace a loose shelf with scrap wood. How to rig a catch basin under a leak. How to keep condensation from ruining bedding. How to use old milk crates as storage under a platform bed. None of it was magic. None of it was treasure. But it was something even better in that moment. It was direction. It was proof that Roy Walker had looked at old machines, broken places, and cast-off materials, and seen possibility. By the time the light faded too low to read, Ethan had made up his mind. Tomorrow before work at Martha Reed's store, he would clean out the cab. Then he would fix the loose door latch. Then he would figure out how to make one corner of the cargo box less like a shelter and more like a place a person could actually live in. He was still thinking about that the next afternoon when he returned from town carrying a roll of heavy trash bags, a gallon jug of water, and a peanut butter sandwich Martha had shoved at him with a gruff, "You look like a kid who forgets to eat." He had just started pulling junk from the truck's side wall when he heard a bicycle tire crunch over gravel. "You really live in there?" Ethan turned. A little girl, maybe 10 or 11, had stopped at the edge of the lot on a faded purple bike. She had a helmet strapped crooked under her chin, a gap-toothed grin, and the kind of fearless curiosity only kids seem to have. "I sleep in there," Ethan said. She considered that. "Is that different?" "A little." She leaned on the handlebars. My grandpa says that truck's been dead longer than his tomatoes in August. Ethan glanced at the side panel he was wiping down. Maybe your grandpa gives up too easy. The girl laughed. It was bright, unfiltered. The first honest laugh Ethan had heard in days. I'm Lucy, she said. Ethan. She nodded toward the truck. You gonna fix it? He looked at the old metal shell, the rust, the dust, the notebook sitting open on the seat beside him. Then he looked back at her. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I am. Lucy came back the next day. And the day after that? Not for long. Just long enough to lean her bike against the fence, watch Ethan work, and ask the kind of questions adults usually forgot how to ask. What's that for? Why are you keeping that board? How do you know which wire is bad? Ethan did not always answer much, but he answered enough. And somehow, in the quiet rhythm of those afternoons, the old box truck began to change. Not all at once, not in some movie magic way. Slowly, piece by piece. The first thing Ethan fixed was the side door latch. It had been half rusted and crooked, barely holding the door in place when the wind picked up. He soaked the hinge in oil, worked it loose with pliers, then reset the latch with 2 salvage bolts he found in the bottom of his father's toolbox. It still groaned when it opened, but now it shut firm and tight. After that, he cleaned the cab. Really cleaned it. He hauled out old wrappers, broken plastic, rotten paper, and a mouse nest from under the passenger seat. He wiped the dashboard with a rag and soapy water until the dull gray vinyl showed through it under the grime. He washed the inside of the windshield using water from his jug and newspaper Martha had let him take from the shop. For the first time, he could see clearly through the glass. It felt strange, like looking out from somewhere that belonged to him. He used scrap wood from behind the loading dock to build a raised sleeping platform along one side of the cargo box. It was rough, uneven in places, but solid. Underneath it, he slid old milk crates for storage, just like Roy had suggested in the notebook. A small place can still be decent if it's clean, warm, and yours. That sentence stayed with him. He repeated it in his head while he worked, when he swept the floor, when he nailed up a board to cover a gap near the wheel well, when he used heavy trash bags and duct tape to seal a drafty seam near the roof. Each small repair gave him something he had not felt in weeks: control. By the second week, Martha Reed had stopped pretending not to notice what he was doing. She never asked direct questions. That was not her style. But one afternoon, after Ethan finished hauling a stack of cracked end tables into the back room of her secondhand shop, she jerked her chin toward a pile near the alley. There's a camp stove out there, she said. Needs a knob. Still lights if you know how to work around it. Ethan looked at her. She kept sorting through a box of chipped coffee mugs like the conversation did not matter. There's also an old curtain panel, she added. Ugly thing, floral, but it's thick. You don't have to do that, Ethan said quietly. Martha snorted. I'm not doing anything. I'm clearing inventory. If trash happens to be useful, that's between you and the trash. He almost smiled. By evening, the camp stove sat inside the truck beside the wall. The curtain hung on a piece of wire behind the cab for privacy, and Ethan had a dented kettle that whistled if you held the handle just right. It was not much, but it changed the feel of the place. It no longer looked like somewhere a boy had crawled into because he had nowhere else to go. It looked like a place a boy was trying to live. That was around the time Sheriff Tom Avery found him. Ethan had just come back from town with a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter when he saw the cruiser parked near the market lot entrance. Tom Avery stood beside it, broad-shouldered in a tan uniform, one hand resting on his belt. He was not a cruel man, but he was a law and order man. And in a town like Belridge, those two things sometimes sat close together. You Ethan Walker? Tom asked. Ethan nodded. Tom looked past him toward the truck. Heard from a couple folks there's somebody camping out here. Ethan gripped the grocery sack tighter. I'm not hurting anything. That may be true. Tom's voice stayed even. But this property's still county-owned. I can't just ignore it. Ethan felt the floor shift under him. He had nowhere else lined up. No plan B. Not even a bad one. Before he could answer, another voice cut across the lot. He's been working for me. Martha. She was striding over from her pickup, arms folded, face set in that brisk, no-nonsense way that made most people think twice before arguing with her. Tom looked at her. That's so? It is. She stopped beside Ethan and glanced toward the truck. Kid's not causing trouble. He works hard, cleans up after himself. I've seen worse living conditions inside some houses on Birch Street. Tom's mouth twitched like he wanted not to react. He studied Ethan a little longer. Then he said, I'm not promising anything permanent, but I'll give you time. Keep it clean. Keep it quiet. No fires outside the truck if the wind's up, and if I hear about theft, vandalism, or any nonsense, you're done here. Understood? Yes, sir, Ethan said. Tom gave one short nod and walked back to the cruiser. When he drove off, Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Martha picked up a loose board near the truck and handed it to him. You're welcome, she said. He looked at her, almost stunned. Thank you, she shrugged. Don't make me regret it. For a little while, things felt steadier. Not easy, but steadier. Then Caleb Dunn found out. Caleb had gone to school with Ethan since middle school. He was 18 now, broad and loud and always surrounded by a few boys who laughed a little too quickly at whatever he said. His family had a decent farm outside town, and Caleb carried that like it made him important. Ethan was tightening a hinge on the truck's rear door one late afternoon when he heard the laughter first, then footsteps, then Caleb's voice. Well, I'll be damned. Ethan turned slowly. Caleb stood a few yards away with two other guys from school, phone already in his hand. You actually live in this thing? Caleb said, grinning. Man, that is sad. One of the others laughed. Truck rat, another muttered. Caleb circled wider, filming now. Look at this, boys, Ethan Walker's own luxury apartment. You got cable in there, buddy? Maybe room service? Ethan's face burned hot. He wanted to say something sharp, something that would cut, but his throat locked up the way it used to in school when too many eyes were on him at once. Caleb zoomed the phone in closer. Smile for the internet. That was the worst part. Not the words. The way humiliation changed shape when somebody recorded it. Turned pain into entertainment. By the time they left still laughing, Ethan felt hollowed out. That night was colder than the others had been. Not because of the weather, because shame has a way of making every space feel smaller. He sat on the edge of his platform bed, Roy's notebook open in his lap, and stared at the page without reading. For the first time since finding the truck, he thought seriously about leaving Belridge. Just disappearing, starting over where nobody knew his name, where nobody had watched him get thrown out, then turned his survival into a joke. But then his eyes dropped to one of Roy's lines in the margin of an old repair page. Don't quit on a thing just because it looks rough in the middle. Middle ain't the end. Ethan read it twice, then a third time. Outside, the wind pushed softly against the side of the truck. Inside, the dim battery lantern cast a tired yellow circle over the wood, the curtain, the crates, the few things he had built with his own hands. And slowly, something inside him hardened, not into bitterness, into resolve. If people were going to look at this truck, he thought, then one day they were going to see more than a place to sleep. They were going to see what he made out of it. The next morning, Ethan woke before sunrise with Roy's notebook still open beside him, and one clear thought settled deep in his chest. If people were going to stare at the truck anyway, then maybe he could give them something worth looking at. For the first time since Dean had thrown him out, Ethan was not just thinking about where he would sleep. He was thinking about what he could build. That shift changed everything. At Martha Reed's store, he started paying closer attention to what people brought in and what they complained about. It was never just furniture or lampshades or old picture frames. It was stories. A widow whose kitchen fan had quit. A farmer whose pressure washer had died right before fence season. A young mom with a busted coffee maker and two kids hanging off her cart. A retired man who stood in the aisle grumbling about how nobody fixed anything anymore. Folks just threw things away and bought new ones, even when they could not afford to. Ethan listened, quietly, the way he always had. And after a few days, the idea in his head stopped feeling like a daydream and started feeling practical. Belridge did not need another big business. It needed somebody who could keep small things running. One afternoon, while Martha was sorting silverware into a dented metal tray, Ethan said, "You think people would pay to have stuff fixed?" She did not look up right away. "That depends," she said. "Can you fix it?" "Some of it." "Then some of them will pay." He stood there for a second. "I mean small engines, fans, heaters, pressure washers, hand tools, maybe generators if they're simple." Now she looked at him, not with pity, not with surprise, with the careful, measuring look of a woman deciding whether something had weight to it. "You planning to do that out of the truck?" Ethan nodded once. Martha leaned back against the counter, arms folded. "That," she said slowly, "is either a terrible idea or a very good one." By the end of the week, the inside of the cargo box had changed again. Ethan cleared the opposite wall and mounted a strip of scrap pegboard Martha let him take from the alley pile. He hung his tools there in neat rows: adjustable wrench, pliers, screwdrivers, socket set, electrical tape, wire cutters, a cheap test light he bought secondhand for $6. He used old coffee cans to organize bolts, washers, clamps, and whatever odd parts he could salvage. He built a narrow workbench from 2 milk crates and a slab of plywood. It was crooked, rough-edged, far from pretty, but it held, and that was enough. Lucy showed up that Saturday with a red marker and a level of excitement that would have powered a small town by itself. "You need a sign," she announced. Ethan was kneeling beside the workbench, tightening one leg with a bolt he had pulled from a broken lawn chair. "A sign? So people know what you do." He gave her a tired half-smile. "I'm pretty sure people already know I live in a truck." Lucy rolled her eyes in the grand, dramatic way only 11-year-old girls could. "No, a real sign." That afternoon, Martha found a square of white-painted plywood in the back of her store and dropped it by the truck without ceremony. "Do what you want with it," she said. So Ethan did. His handwriting was not fancy, but it was clear. Ethan Walker, small engine and home tool, repair fair price, honest work. He stared at the board after he finished. The words looked almost too big, too brave, like he was claiming something before he had earned it. Martha came by later, read the sign, and grunted. "Well," she said, "at least you're not overselling yourself." He could not tell whether that meant approval. With Martha, it usually did. The first real customer came because of Lucy. Her grandfather, Mr. Bennett, showed up in a battered Ford with an old gas-powered tiller strapped into the bed. He was wiry, sun-browned, and suspicious in the way older men often were when they had spent a lifetime fixing their own things. Lucy hopped out first. "I told him you could do it." Mr. Bennett frowned at Ethan. "Machine won't start. Been sitting since last summer. Carburetor's probably shot." Ethan crouched beside the tiller, checked the fuel line, pulled the spark plug, and looked at the grime around the intake. "It's not the carb," he said. Mr. Bennett raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "No, sir, but I think it's the fuel." That answer seemed to help. It sounded honest. Not flashy, just honest. Ethan worked on it for nearly an hour. He cleaned the line, drained the old gas, reset the plug, and adjusted the choke assembly with patient fingers and a concentration that made the rest of the world fall away. When the tiller coughed, rattled, then roared alive, Lucy clapped like she had just seen fireworks. Mr. Bennett stared for a beat, then shut the machine off and looked at Ethan differently than before. "How much?" Ethan hesitated. He had not settled on prices. He did not want to charge too much. He did not want to insult the man either. $20? Mr. Bennett reached into his pocket, pulled out 2 tens, then added a 5. "For being faster than I was going to be," he said. The $5 stayed with Ethan more than the 20, because it was not charity. It was respect. After that, word began to move the way it always moved in small towns. Quiet at first, then everywhere. A woman brought in a box fan that squealed like a dying bird. A man from the edge of County Road came with a hedge trimmer that kept cutting out. A single mom dropped off a little space heater and said, "If this can be saved, I'd sure appreciate it." Ethan fixed what he could, and when he could not, he said so. No fake promises. No made-up parts. No charging for things that did not need replacing. People noticed that too. By the second week, folks were no longer saying, "That boy living in the old truck." They were saying, "You tried Ethan yet?" And for the first time since being thrown out, Ethan felt something stronger than survival beginning to take shape. A place, a use, a name people said with a little faith in it. But news traveled farther than Main Street. And one evening, just as Ethan was closing the truck doors with grease on his hands and a few folded bills in his front pocket, he looked up and saw Dean Holloway's truck slowing down on the county road. Dean did not stop. Not yet. He just drove past slow enough to see the sign. Slow enough to see Ethan standing there. Slow enough for Ethan to recognize the look on his face. It was not concern. It was not guilt. It was something narrower, sharper. The look of a man who had thrown something away and was starting to realize it still had value. 2 days after Dean Holloway drove past the old market lot and looked at Ethan like a man rethinking a bad decision, the weather turned. In Belridge, people knew how to read the sky. You learned it young. The farmers watched the winds shift before supper. The old men at the gas station stopped talking about baseball and started talking about pressure drops. Even the dogs seemed restless, pacing porches and barking at nothing anybody else could see. By Wednesday afternoon, the air had gone heavy and strange. The clouds rolled in low over the Missouri fields, thick and bruised, swallowing the sun until the whole town looked washed in iron-gray light. Store owners moved sandwich boards inside. Mothers hurried kids from ball practice. The church secretary taped a handwritten sign to the fellowship hall door in case the power went out and people needed somewhere to gather. Ethan was inside the truck, sorting small parts into coffee cans, when Martha pulled up fast enough to throw gravel. She stepped out of her pickup and looked at the sky. "This one's got teeth," she said. Ethan followed her gaze. The wind was picking up now, hard enough to rattle the old sign Lucy had helped him paint. "You think it'll be bad?" he asked. Martha gave him a flat look. "I think you should tie down anything you don't want halfway to Kansas." So that was what they did. For the next hour, Ethan secured everything he could. He stacked loose lumber under the truck, latched every door twice, wrapped a tarp over the tool bench inside the cargo box, and moved his smaller equipment into the cab. Martha helped without making a big thing of it. She handed him rope, checked knots, and grumbled at the wind like it had personally offended her. By the time the first rain came, it came sideways. Not gentle, not gradual. It hit the truck in hard slanting sheets that drummed on the roof and turned the gravel lot into dark mud within minutes. Lightning cracked somewhere west of town. Thunder followed close behind, deep enough to shake the side mirrors. Martha stood by her truck door and shouted over the storm, "You staying here?" Ethan nodded. He knew every weak point in the truck now, every draft, every latch, every place the rain tried to push in. "I'll be fine," he called back. She narrowed her eyes like she was deciding whether to argue. Then she said, "If it gets worse, come to the store. Back door keys under the blue planter." And then she drove off into the rain. By 7 o'clock, Belridge had lost power. Ethan knew it before he even looked toward town. The glow that usually sat low over Main Street was gone. The houses beyond the county road had gone dark too, one by one, until the only light left came from the white flash of lightning and the yellow battery lantern hanging inside the truck. The rain kept coming. The wind got meaner, and then his phone buzzed. It was Lucy. "Grandpa says the whole south side is out. Mrs. Pritchard's basement is taking water. Caleb Dunn's farm lost power too." Ethan stared at the screen. Then another message came. "Can you charge phones in the truck?" He looked around the cargo box. At the small battery setup he had cobbled together from salvaged deep-cycle batteries, a converter, and the kind of stubborn trial and error Roy's notebook had taught him not to be afraid of. It was not much, but it was something. He texted back, "A few, tell people to bring chargers." He did not expect many. But within 30 minutes, headlights began cutting through the rain. First, it was Mr. Bennett with Lucy, carrying 2 phones in a bread bag to keep them dry. Then a young mother from Willow Street with a dead phone and panic in her eyes because her little boy used a breathing monitor at night and she needed to stay in touch with his doctor if things got worse. Then Mrs. Pritchard's nephew with a sump pump switch in one hand and water up to his ankles. The truck, which had once been nothing but a place to hide, turned into something else entirely. A lit-up island in the storm. Ethan worked fast. He plugged phones into the converter. He checked cords. He reset a tripped breaker on the Bennett Place battery pack. He opened a space on the bench and took apart the sump switch with water still dripping off his sleeves. His fingers moved steady, his mind narrowing into that calm, focused place that always came when something mechanical needed him more than his fear did. Outside, the storm kept hammering the town. Inside, people started looking at Ethan in a way they never had before. Not as a boy they felt sorry for. Not as the kid in the truck. As the person who knew what to do. Around 9 o'clock, Sheriff Tom Avery's cruiser rolled into the lot, lights flashing blue across the rain. Tom stepped out, hat pulled low, jacket soaked through. "We got trouble out at the Dunn place," he said without preamble. "Main pump for the livestock shed is down. Water's backing up fast. Their backup generator won't hold. Caleb's granddad is on an oxygen concentrator, and if that battery fails, they're in real trouble." Ethan wiped his hands on a rag. "What's wrong with the pump?" Tom shook his head. "Don't know. Caleb says it just died." At the name, something old and sharp flickered through Ethan's chest. He remembered the laughter. The phone pointed at his face. Truck rat. Tom must have seen something shift in him, because his voice softened just a little. "I know there's history there," he said, "but if we lose that shed, they'll lose feed, equipment, maybe animals. And that old man in the house needs steady power." Before Ethan could answer, another truck came sliding into the lot. Caleb jumped out before it fully stopped. He was drenched, breathing hard. Mud splashed up both Gene's legs. And for the first time in Ethan's life, Caleb Dunn looked scared enough to forget pride. "Ethan," he said, voice cracking on the name. "Please." Just that. No joke. No smirk. No crowd to impress. Just a frightened kid standing in the rain asking for help. The lot went quiet except for thunder. For one long second, Ethan did nothing. He could have said no. He could have let Caleb sit in the full weight of what cruelty costs when life turns hard. Part of him wanted to. But then he thought about Roy, about the notebook, about every line his father had written about fixing what you could while you still had the chance. He grabbed his tool bag. "Show me the pump." Tom opened the cruiser trunk for extra lights. Caleb stepped back, stunned for half a beat, then ran for his truck. The rain hit harder as Ethan climbed in beside him, tool bag between his boots, heart pounding, not from fear this time, but from the feeling that this night was about to change more than one life. Caleb Dunn drove like the storm was chasing him. Maybe it was. Rain lashed the windshield so hard the wipers could barely keep up. The county road had turned slick and black, with muddy water running along both shoulders. Every few seconds, lightning tore across the sky and showed the fields in sharp white flashes. Fences bending in the wind, tree limbs twisted low, puddles growing into floodwater. Ethan held the tool bag between his boots and said nothing. Caleb kept both hands locked on the wheel. "My granddad's battery backup is already dropping," he said, voice tight. "If the main line doesn't hold, we're in trouble." Ethan looked out through the blur of rain. What happened to the pump? It kicked off, then made this grinding sound. Then nothing. Water started rising in the livestock shed maybe 10 minutes later. I tried restarting it twice. "You checked the breaker?" "Yeah, didn't do anything." Ethan nodded once. That at least gave him a place to start. When they pulled into the Dunn farm, the whole property looked like it had been dropped into chaos. One barn light flickered weak and yellow off a backup line. Water pooled deep around the equipment shed. A side gate banged in the wind. Somewhere cattle were making that low, uneasy sound animals made when they felt trouble before people did. Sheriff Tom's cruiser was already there. So was Mr. Dunn, Caleb's father, soaked to the skin and shouting directions nobody could really hear over the weather. Caleb jumped out first. Ethan followed, boots sinking into mud, rain hitting his shoulders like handfuls of gravel. The pump house sat behind the livestock shed, half surrounded by rising water. Ethan crouched beside the unit, flashed his work light over the motor casing, and listened. Even before he touched it, he could tell the thing had been pushed too hard. He checked the line, then the switch, then the intake housing. Finally, he found it. A twisted piece of metal debris had jammed the impeller housing just enough to lock the motor under load. "It's binding," Ethan shouted. Mr. Dunn stared at him. "Can you fix it?" Ethan looked at the water, the age of the unit, the rust along the bolts, the storm still hammering the roof above them. He could not promise easy, but he knew enough not to panic. "I can try." For the next 20 minutes, the world narrowed down to cold fingers, wet tools, and stubborn metal. Caleb held the flashlight steady. Tom braced a tarp over the opening as best he could. Mr. Dunn ran extension cord checks back toward the backup line. Nobody joked. Nobody questioned Ethan. Nobody looked at him like a kid sleeping in a truck. They looked at him like the person standing between disaster and a fighting chance. At last, one bolt gave. Then another. Ethan pried the housing open, pulled the twisted debris free, reset the alignment, and spun the impeller by hand. Smooth. He stepped back, breathing hard. "Try it now." Mr. Dunn hit the switch. For one terrible second, nothing happened. Then the motor coughed, growled, and came roaring back to life. Water surged through the outflow pipe. The pressure line steadied. The men around Ethan all froze, staring. Then Caleb let out a breath so raw it almost sounded like a laugh. Inside the house, a porch light blinked stronger. The backup load eased. Somewhere in the barn, the uneasy sound from the cattle began to settle. Tom clapped Ethan once on the shoulder. "That," he said, "just saved this place a world of hurt." Caleb looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, rain running down his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "Not polished, not public, not clever, just true. I was a jerk, worse than that, and you still came." Ethan stood there in the mud, soaked through, exhausted, and suddenly aware of how different the night felt from every other one before it. He could have held on to the anger. Maybe part of him always would, a little. But standing there with the storm breaking around them and the pump running strong again, he found he did not need revenge nearly as much as he had once thought. He just needed his life back. Caleb swallowed hard. "Thank you." Ethan gave one tired nod. "You're welcome." By morning, the worst of the storm had passed. Belridge looked battered but standing. Branches down. Power still out in patches. Roadside ditches full, but standing. And by noon, word had spread all over town. Not about the boy living in an abandoned truck. About Ethan Walker, the boy who kept phones charging during the blackout. The boy who fixed the Dunn pump in the middle of the storm. The boy who knew what he was doing. A week later, Sheriff Tom came by the old market lot with forms for a county vocational program and information on how Ethan could finish school while apprenticing legally. Martha Reed brought him a used lockbox, 2 good shop lights, and muttered, "Every real business needs to stop looking half feral." Lucy painted him a better sign, brighter and straighter than the first one. And one quiet evening, Carla came. His mother stood beside the truck with tears in her eyes and shame written all over her face. "I should have fought for you," she said. "I should have chosen you." Ethan believed she meant it. That was the hard part. He loved her, but love and trust were not always repaired in the same hour. So he told her the truth. "I'm not ready to come back." She nodded through tears. "I know." And for the first time in his life, Ethan did not feel like a boy asking permission to have boundaries. He felt like someone building a future with his own hands. By summer, the truck had a stronger workbench, better storage, and a real customer list pinned beside Roy's notebook. People still drove past slow sometimes, but now they were not laughing. They were looking, respecting, remembering. And Ethan, the boy who had once stood on a porch with nowhere to go, had built something nobody could throw away. So let me ask you, if life stripped away your comfort, your roof, and the people you thought would protect you, would you still have the courage to build anyway? If this story moved you and you believe quiet strength still matters, subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay with us for more stories about resilience, dignity, and the kind of hope that refuses to quit.